October 130 AD. The Nile River, near Hermopolis. Moonlight reflects off black water as Emperor Hadrian holds Antinous' head beneath the surface. The beautiful youth stops struggling after 40 seconds. After 90 seconds, bubbles cease rising. After 3 minutes, the body goes limp. But Hadrian keeps holding him under, whispering incantations in languages that predate Rome, waiting for something the Egyptian priests promised would happen at the moment between death and whatever comes after. This is not murder. Not exactly. The Syrian magician Pancrates assured him its transformation. The boy will die mortal and rise divine. His soul, captured at the precise moment of expiration during ecstasy, will transfer its youth to Hadrian. The emperor will gain decades of life. Antinous will gain eternal worship. Everyone benefits, except Antinous, whose opinion was never requested. The water around the body begins to glow. Or perhaps that's just phosphorescence disturbed by movement. Hadrian feels something transfer from the cooling flesh to his own. Or perhaps that's just the rush of murder disguised as mysticism. When he finally releases the body, letting it float downstream, he's convinced he's absorbed 20 years of youth. The priests assure him the ritual succeeded. They wouldn't dare suggest otherwise. Within hours, Hadrian declares Antinous a god. Within days, a city rises at this spot. Within months, 2,000 statues are commissioned. The empire will worship a boy whose death was planned for 18 months, orchestrated through mystery religions that turned murder into theology. But here's what makes this scene remarkable. This isn't Nero fiddling while Rome burns. This isn't Caligula declaring war on Neptune. This isn't Commodus fighting as a gladiator. This isn't Elagabalus marrying a Vestal virgin. Those stories you know. Those emperors have become Hollywood villains. Their atrocities so repeated, they've lost their power to shock. Tonight, we descend into darker territory. The emperors, whose names you might not recognize, but whose practices surpassed even Caligula's madness. Men who transformed imperial power into machinery for personal gratification, so extreme that ancient historians, men who lived through Nero's reign, refuse to document the full details. Caracalla, who made his mother more than witness to fratricide. Valentinian, whose rage literally exploded his brain. Constans, whose collection of barbarian boys required architectural modifications. Hadrian, who drowned his lover for immortality. Valentinian III, who turned senatorial wives into currency of domination. Maximinus Thrax, the 8-foot giant whose appetites destroyed women through simple physics. Valens, who mixed sorcery with sovereignty until reality itself rebelled at Adrianople. These men didn't just abuse power, they revealed what happens when absolute authority meets appetites that recognize no boundaries, when the only law is the emperor's desire, when even lovers become ingredients in rituals that would horrify the gods themselves. Hadrian pulls Antinous from the water one last time, not to save him but to whisper something in his unhearing ear, something about what parts of the boy will be preserved in statues across the empire. Something about how death is just the beginning of service. Something about appetites that transcend mortality itself. The priests who witnessed this ritual, who helped prepare the astronomical calculations, who provided the necessary incantations, they took vows of silence that they maintained unto death, or so everyone thought. Until archaeologists excavating near Antinopolis found papyri hidden in pottery, written in Coptic by Egyptian priests who needed someone, someday, to know what really happened when a god was made from a murdered boy. This is their testimony. Before diving into these forgotten stories of power and corruption, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you are listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together, from different parts of the world, connected across time and space, by our shared curiosity about the past. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, called Caracalla after the Gallic cloak he wore, inherited the throne alongside his brother Geta in 211. Their father, Septimius Severus, had forced them to rule together, hoping shared power would prevent civil war. Instead, he engineered fratricide with maternal witness. The palace was physically divided between the brothers. Separate entrances, separate staffs, separate dining halls. They communicated through their mother Julia Domna, who spent her days shuttling between hostile camps within her own home. The only neutral ground was her quarters, which made them the natural site for what Caracalla planned. The murder itself was swift, but its aftermath reveals the true horror. Geta's blood hadn't cooled before Caracalla began the systematic erasure of his brother's existence. 20,000 people died in the purges that followed. Not just Geta's supporters, but anyone who had ever spoken to him kindly, looked at him favorably, or failed to celebrate his death with sufficient enthusiasm. The damnatio memoriae went beyond typical Roman practice. Geta's name was chiseled from monuments, his face scratched from family portraits, his statues melted down. But Caracalla went further. He forced artists to repaint frescoes in private homes, removing Geta from dinner scenes. He had Geta's childhood toys destroyed. He killed the servants who had raised them both because they remembered when two brothers existed. More disturbing was what he demanded of Julia Domna. She was forbidden to mourn, not just publicly but privately. Caracalla had spies among her servants who reported any sign of grief. She had to smile at state functions. She had to praise Caracalla's sole rule. She had to pretend her younger son had never existed, while his blood still stained her clothing, because Caracalla ordered those garments preserved. Ancient sources, particularly Cassius Dio, who lived through these events, suggest something darker in Caracalla's relationship with his mother. The emperor, who had just murdered his brother in her arms, now demanded she share his bed, not metaphorically as partner in power, but literally as replacement for the wives he ignored. The evidence is carefully worded, but consistent across sources. Caracalla dismissed his wife, Fulvia Plautilla, exiling her to Lipari, where she was later executed. He took no other official wife. Instead, Julia Domna appeared at ceremonies in positions reserved for empresses, not mothers. She received visitors in Caracalla's bedchamber. She accompanied him to military camps, where they shared quarters that shocked even hardened soldiers. Herodian, writing closer to events, describes Julia Domna's appearance changing after Geta's death. She began wearing her hair in styles associated with younger women. Her clothing became more revealing despite her age. These weren't her choices. Caracalla dictated her appearance, transforming his mother into something that suited appetites even Romans struggled to name. The Syrian origin of Julia Domna added another dimension. Caracalla became obsessed with Eastern mysteries, particularly those involving divine incest. He pointed to pharaonic marriages between siblings, Persian customs of keeping bloodlines pure, myths of gods who coupled with their mothers to create new worlds. He wasn't justifying his actions so much as declaring them sacred. Palace slaves left accounts, preserved in Egyptian papyri, describing sounds from the imperial bedchamber that suggested Julia Domna's suffering went beyond emotional torture. They describe her emerging with bruises that makeup couldn't hide. They mention physicians treating injuries that suggested violent intimacy. They record her begging servants for herbs that would prevent pregnancy or end it if prevention failed. The public face remained composed. Julia Domna attended Senate meetings, issued coins with her image, patronized intellectuals. She was called Mother of the Senate, Mother of the Camps, titles that rang with sick irony given what her actual son demanded privately. She maintained this facade for 6 years, until Caracalla's assassination in 217. When news of his death reached her, witnesses say Julia Domna laughed for the first time since Geta's murder. Then she refused food and medical treatment for breast cancer she had hidden, dying within weeks. Some called it grief for her son. Others understood it as relief that her torture had finally ended. But even death brought no peace. Caracalla had left instructions for their joint burial, their bodies positioned in ways that suggested eternal intimacy. The Roman priests, horrified but obedient, carried out these wishes. Somewhere beneath Syrian sand, a mother and son lie arranged in death as he had arranged them in life. 375 A.D. The Danube frontier. Emperor Valentinian I receives envoys from the Quadi tribe in his military tent. They've come to negotiate peace. They don't know they're about to witness a death that medical historians still study as one of history's most violent strokes. Valentinian starts calmly, his voice controlled as he lists Quadi violations of their treaty. But as he speaks, observers notice changes. Veins bulge across his forehead. His face shifts from red to purple. Spittle flies with increasing velocity. His words become less coherent, more guttural, until they're not words at all but animal sounds of rage. Then he literally explodes. Blood vessels burst in his brain with such force that blood spurts from his nose, ears, and according to some accounts, even his eyes. He collapses, convulsing, dying in minutes from what physicians would later recognize as a massive hemorrhagic stroke caused by pure fury. This wasn't his first explosion, just his last. Valentinian had weaponized rage throughout his 11-year reign, using volcanic anger as a tool of governance that left courts terrified and subjects traumatized. But the rage was selective, strategic, and often sexual in its expression. Ammianus Marcellinus, who served under Valentinian, describes the emperor's justice sessions with disturbing detail. When dealing with accused traitors, Valentinian wouldn't just order executions. He would force entire families to watch elaborate tortures, but with specific additions. Wives would be stripped and examined for marks of conspiracy. Daughters would be investigated for knowledge of their father's crimes. The investigation process involved bringing women to private chambers where Valentinian would personally conduct interrogations. These sessions lasted hours. Women emerged shaking, clothes torn, unable to speak about what had occurred. Some never emerged at all, their bodies found later in the Danube, marked in ways that suggested interrogation had become something else entirely. The pattern was consistent enough that noble families developed strategies. When summoned for justice, they would send their ugly daughters, their elderly wives, hoping to minimize the emperor's interest. It rarely worked. Valentinian's appetites weren't about beauty, but about power, about breaking what others valued, about demonstrating that nothing was beyond his reach. One incident stands out in court records. A senator named Maximus was accused of embezzlement. During his trial, Valentinian ordered Maximus's wife brought forward to verify testimony. In full view of the court, he had her clothing cut away with knives, claiming to search for hidden documents. Finding none, he declared she must have swallowed them, and ordered a cavity search that he supervised personally. The humiliation was the point. Maximus broke, confessing to crimes he hadn't committed just to end his wife's ordeal. She survived but never spoke again, retreating into silence that lasted until her death years later. The court got the message. Opposing Valentinian meant watching him violate everything you loved while legally calling it justice. His relationship with his own wife, Justina, was equally disturbing. He would parade her naked through military camps, claiming it demonstrated Roman beauty to barbarian auxiliaries. He would force her to serve wine at banquets wearing nothing but jewelry, then offer her to generals who pleased him. She endured because refusing meant death, not just for her, but for her children. The administrative structure enabled these practices. Valentinian appointed officials based on their willingness to procure whatever the emperor desired. A prefect named Maximinus gained promotion by supplying increasingly specific requests: twins from Gaul, virgins from Syria, boys who looked like young Alexander. The procurement network reached across the empire, a vast machinery of human trafficking operated by the state itself. Military campaigns became hunting expeditions for human prizes. After defeating Germanic tribes, Valentinian would personally select captives, not for slavery, but for his private collection. He particularly favored the daughters of chieftains, keeping them in special quarters where he could demonstrate Roman superiority through systematic violation. The court developed euphemisms for these activities. Private consultation meant rape. Enhanced interrogation meant intimate torture. Imperial inspection meant the emperor would be visiting wives and daughters while husbands and fathers waited outside. Everyone understood the code. No one dared speak plainly. His death brought relief that chroniclers struggled to hide. The Quadi envoys, who witnessed his explosive end, reported that Roman courtiers seemed more shocked by the sudden peace than grieved by the loss. His son Gratian quietly released the women held in his father's private quarters, though most were too broken to return to normal life. The medical details of Valentinian's death fascinate historians because they suggest a connection between his violent appetites and his violent end. The same rage that drove him to brutality finally turned inward, destroying the brain that had conceived such creative cruelty. His blood pressure at death was probably above 250, sufficient to literally blow apart cerebral arteries. January 350 AD, Constans I flees through Gallic snow, pursued by the usurper Magnentius's soldiers. He's abandoned by troops who have finally had enough of an emperor whose appetites disrupted military discipline, diplomatic relations, and basic Roman concepts of masculinity. He dies alone in a fortified villa, betrayed by men who once swore loyalty, but could no longer stomach what they had to enable. Constans had ruled the western third of the Roman Empire since 337, inheriting it from Constantine the Great, his father. But while Constantine had channeled his energies into religious transformation and military conquest, Constans focused on collecting beautiful barbarian boys like other emperors collected art. The process began during routine military inspections. Constans would tour frontier garrisons, ostensibly checking defenses. In reality, he was shopping. When Germanic tribes sent hostages to guarantee treaties, Constans personally selected which ones to keep. The criteria were consistent: male, young, blonde, tall, and possessing what chronicles delicately call barbarian beauty. These selections weren't random acquisitions, but organized programs. Constans established what he called the Sacred Band, named after the Theban military unit of paired male lovers. But this wasn't a fighting force. These were ornamental soldiers, trained in ceremonial combat that emphasized physical display over actual warfare. The daily routine in Constans's court horrified traditional Romans. The emperor would rise at noon, having spent mornings in private quarters with rotating selections from his collection. Afternoon involved watching his barbarians wrestle naked, their bodies oiled, the matches choreographed for aesthetic appeal rather than competition. Evenings brought elaborate banquets where these young men served as living decoration, positioned around the dining hall, in poses that emphasized their physical attributes. Military commanders complained that Constans disrupted entire campaigns to acquire specific individuals. During negotiations with the Franks, he spotted the chieftain's son, a youth named Clodomir, described as having hair like spun gold. Constans immediately restructured the entire treaty to include Clodomir as a hostage, offering territorial concessions that weakened Roman frontiers just to acquire one beautiful boy. The favoritism shown to these barbarians created dangerous precedents. They received Roman citizenship without service. They commanded salaries exceeding those of veteran soldiers. They wore purple-trimmed togas, a privilege of nobility. Actual Roman soldiers watched foreign boys who had never fought receive rewards that legionaries earned through decades of combat. More disturbing were the private ceremonies Constans conducted. Drawing on mystery religions, he created rituals that combined Germanic paganism with Roman state ceremony. These involved midnight gatherings in underground chambers where barbarian boys were initiated into sacred mysteries that seemed to consist primarily of activities that violated both Roman law and barbarian custom. A Frank named Silvanus, who later became a Roman general, left a coded account of his time in Constans' collection. He describes being 14 when selected, spending 3 years in conditions he compares to expensive captivity. He was taught Latin, Greek, and specific physical techniques that had nothing to do with language. He learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, to position himself for optimal viewing, to perform enthusiasm for activities that Germanic culture considered abomination. The administrative apparatus supporting Constans' collecting was vast. Scouts operated along all frontiers, identifying potential acquisitions. Traders were paid to report beautiful youth in barbarian territories. Diplomatic missions included assessments of local boys alongside military intelligence. The empire's foreign policy increasingly bent toward acquiring human ornaments for the emperor's collection. Some barbarian tribes learned to exploit this weakness. The Alemanni would parade their most beautiful young men during negotiations, using them as bargaining chips. The Vandals sent gifts of selected youth to gain favorable terms. The Sarmatians offered twin brothers who were rumored to be the most beautiful males on the steppes, receiving in exchange military support that allowed them to dominate rival tribes. The Roman Senate grew increasingly uncomfortable with an emperor who seemed more interested in barbarian flesh than Roman governance. Sessions where Constans attended were disrupted by his bringing favorites who would lounge at his feet, fed grapes while senators discussed policy. Important legislation was ignored while Constans whispered with blonde boys who spoke broken Latin. The breaking point came when Constans attempted to legally marry one of his favorites, a Vandal prince named Wulfila. Roman law had no framework for same-sex marriage, especially between an emperor and a barbarian. Constans tried to create one, proposing legislation that would have fundamentally altered Roman concepts of marriage, citizenship, and inheritance. The military finally revolted. Magnentius, a commander of partially barbarian origin himself, understood how to channel the army's disgust into rebellion. He promised to restore Roman dignity, to remove the perfumed boys from court, to make the empire masculine again. The soldiers who had watched Constans fondle Germans while ignoring frontier defense flocked to Magnentius's standard. Constans' death was particularly pathetic. Abandoned by his beautiful barbarians who fled at the first sign of danger, he died begging for mercy from soldiers who had once protected him. His last words, according to witnesses, were asking whether Wulfila had escaped safely. The Vandal prince had actually joined Magnentius, providing intelligence about Constans's movements in exchange for safe passage home. October 130 AD. The Nile River near Hermopolis. The imperial barge glides through brown water, while Emperor Hadrian conducts a ceremony that Egyptian priests don't recognize. At the ritual's center lies Antinous, the emperor's lover, young and beautiful and about to become either a sacrifice or a suicide, depending on which whispered account you believe. Hours later, Antinous is dead in the river. Hadrian emerges from his cabin transformed, speaking of visions and divine revelations. Within days, he declares Antinous a god. Within months, an entire city rises from sand. Within years, Antinous cults spread across the empire like infection, each shrine a monument to love or murder or something darker that combines both. Hadrian was 54 when he met Antinous in Bithynia. The boy was perhaps 14, selected from local nobility for his beauty that ancient sources struggle to describe without descending into worship themselves. Statues that survive show a youth whose features combined masculine strength with feminine delicacy, whose body represented Greek ideals of ephebic perfection. The relationship scandalized even Romans accustomed to pederasty. This wasn't the traditional Erastes Eromenos arrangement with its educational pretenses and time limits. Hadrian abandoned governmental duties to travel with Antinous. He commissioned hundreds of sculptures, depicting the boy in various states of undress. He wrote poetry that court scribes refused to copy, considering it too explicit for preservation. The Egyptian journey in 130 was supposed to be administrative, reviewing provincial governance. Instead, it became what witnesses described as a mystery tour, with Hadrian consulting magicians, participating in underground rites, seeking something that required Antinous' presence at increasingly dangerous ceremonies. Egyptian priests later testified, under considerable pressure, about Hadrian's interests. He wasn't seeking standard blessings or conventional wisdom. He wanted specific knowledge about life extension, soul transference, the creation of divine beings through human sacrifice. He particularly studied the Osiris myths, where death and resurrection intertwine with sexual congress. The night Antinous died, the imperial barge had anchored at a spot Hadrian selected for astronomical significance. Mars, Venus, and Mercury aligned in configurations that Egyptian astrology associated with transformation. The emperor had dismissed all attendants, except for a Syrian magician named Pancrates and 2 deaf-mute slaves who couldn't report what they witnessed. The official story claimed Antinous fell overboard accidentally. The whispered version said he jumped to fulfill a prophecy that his death would extend Hadrian's life. The darkest rumor suggested neither accident nor suicide but ritual murder, with Hadrian drowning his lover at the moment of climax to capture his soul at its most potent. What followed supports the darkest interpretation. Hadrian's immediate actions weren't those of a grieving lover, but of someone executing a predetermined plan. He founded Antinopolis at the exact spot of death. He declared Antinous a god before the body was cold. He instituted mysteries that participants were sworn never to reveal, on pain of death, that several suffered rather than speak. The Antinous cult that spread across the empire was unlike any imperial worship. These weren't temples for state ceremony, but centers for nocturnal rites that required initiation. Participants spoke of experiencing Antinous' presence in ways that suggested more than metaphor. They described visions of the youth that were too explicit, encounters that left physical marks, possessions that transformed personality. Hadrian himself changed after Antinous' death, in ways that disturbed court physicians. He would speak in voices that weren't his own, sometimes sounding remarkably like the dead youth. He would enter trances where he performed acts his conscious mind supposedly couldn't remember. He aged rapidly, as if whatever magic he had attempted had backfired, stealing years rather than granting them. The architectural program Hadrian launched defied economic sense. Over 2,000 statues of Antinous were commissioned, more than any figure except Augustus. Temples rose in 30 cities. Coins bearing the boy's image flooded currency markets. Games celebrating his divinity required imperial subsidies that strained treasuries. This wasn't mourning, but something more obsessive, more desperate, as if Hadrian was trying to resurrect through marble what he had destroyed in flesh. Private letters that survived in Egyptian monasteries suggest Hadrian believed he had succeeded in some form of preservation. He writes about conversations with Antinous that occurred years after the drowning. He describes physical encounters that left him exhausted and marked. He claims the boy's spirit resided in various statues, moving between them at will. The mysteries of Antinous involved practices that combined Egyptian death rituals with Greek sexuality. Initiates were required to undergo symbolic drowning, then resurrection through acts that pantomimed Hadrian's relationship with the deified youth. These ceremonies created scandal even in cities accustomed to mystery religions, with reports of participants emerging physically and psychologically transformed. Modern archaeological discoveries support something unusual about Antinous sites. Statues show signs of regular anointing with substances that chemical analysis can't identify. Temple foundations contain chambers that served no architectural purpose, but had acoustic properties that created disorienting effects. Burial sites near Antinous temples show bodies positioned in ways that suggest ritual death rather than natural causes. Hadrian spent his final years increasingly obsessed with rejoining Antinous. He consulted every oracle, magician, and mystic in the empire. He attempted ceremonies that required components so disturbing that suppliers refused imperial commissions. His death in 138 was preceded by weeks of delirium, in which he begged Antinous to either take him or release him. The succession was complicated by documents Hadrian left requesting burial procedures that violated Roman custom and law. He wanted his body positioned with representations of Antinous in configurations that suggested eternal intimacy. His successor, Antoninus Pius, quietly ignored most requests, though rumors persisted that certain requirements were secretly fulfilled. March 16, 455. Rome's Campus Martius, Emperor Valentinian. The third practices archery, while two men approach from behind. He doesn't recognize them as husbands and fathers of women he's violated. The first sword thrust enters below his ribs. The second opens his throat. As he bleeds out on manicured grass, they tell him exactly whose wives and daughters he had taken, making sure he knows why he's dying. Valentinian had inherited the Western Empire at age 6, ruled by his mother Galla Placidia until he came of age. When he finally took personal control, he revealed appetites that made even the decadent Roman aristocracy uncomfortable. This wasn't the homosexual preference of some emperors or the incestuous obsessions of others. Valentinian specifically targeted the wives and daughters of powerful Romans, treating violation as a form of political domination. The system was methodical. Valentinian would summon senators for consultation, requiring them to bring their families to demonstrate loyalty. During meetings, he would have wives and daughters separated for private audiences, while husbands and fathers discussed policy. These audiences occurred in chambers adjacent to meeting rooms, close enough that sounds carried through walls, deliberately left thin. The message was explicit. Your power means nothing. Your family is mine. Your women are imperial property. Senators would sit through policy discussions while hearing their wives' distress through walls, forced to maintain composure or face treason charges. The humiliation was multiplied by having to thank the emperor afterward, praising his wisdom while their violated women stood beside them. Petronius Maximus, a senator whose wife Valentinian had repeatedly summoned, began documenting the pattern. His journal, hidden for centuries, records dates, names, and aftermath. Some women killed themselves rather than face repeated summons. Others were divorced by husbands who couldn't bear the shame. Many retreated into convents, seeking sanctuary in religious life. The emperor's method involved legal manipulation that made resistance impossible. He would declare certain women imperial consultants on feminine matters, requiring their presence at court. He established a council of matrons that supposedly advised on domestic policy but actually provided him rotating access to Rome's noblewomen. Refusing these appointments meant treason. One incident escalated beyond even Valentinian's usual violations. Licinius Maxima, daughter of a powerful general, was engaged to marry a young senator. Valentinian summoned her for consultation about wedding preparations, claiming imperial interest in aristocratic marriages. She never returned home intact. Her fiancé found her the next morning in the palace gardens, clothing torn, body marked, mind broken. The general, her father, demanded justice. Valentinian responded by having him arrested for conspiracy, using evidence that suggested planning violence against the emperor. The evidence was real. The general had been planning exactly that. But Valentinian's spy network had provided warning, allowing him to eliminate a threat while keeping the daughter for continued use. The administrative structure enabled systematic assault. Palace appointments were scheduled to ensure fresh victims arrived regularly. Medical staff were required to treat injuries quietly. Servants who witnessed activities were transferred to frontier posts where life expectancy was minimal. The entire imperial household became machinery for predation. Foreign relations suffered as Valentinian's reputation spread. Barbarian chieftains refused to send daughters as diplomatic hostages. Allied kingdoms wouldn't negotiate marriages that required women visiting Rome. Even tribute payments declined as rulers feared their representatives' wives might catch the emperor's attention. The breaking point came when Valentinian targeted the wrong woman. Sources disagree whether she was Maximus's wife or Heraclius's daughter, but consensus exists on the result. The husbands and fathers of violated women formed a conspiracy that transcended political divisions. Senators who had been enemies united in shared humiliation. The assassination was deliberately public and brutal. They wanted Valentinian to suffer as their women had suffered. The 16 wounds found on his corpse weren't random but targeted, each representing a specific woman he had violated. The assassins took turns, announcing names as they struck. This for Lucilla, this for Marcella, this for Claudia. After Valentinian's death, documents emerged, revealing the full scope, lists of women summoned, rated by his satisfaction. Medical records of treatments required afterward. Financial accounts showing payments to families for silence. The bureaucracy of rape was more horrifying than individual incidents, showing systematic intimate violence as state policy. Petronius Maximus briefly became emperor after Valentinian's death, but his reign lasted only 77 days. He had participated in the assassination to avenge his wife, but then married Valentinian's widow, Eudoxia, forcing her into the same position her husband had forced others. She responded by inviting the Vandals to sack Rome, preferring barbarian conquest to continued Roman hypocrisy. The Vandal sack of 455, following shortly after Valentinian's death, is often blamed on military weakness, but contemporary sources suggest it was more personal. Eudoxia provided the Vandal king Gaiseric with lists of senators who had enabled Valentinian's practices. The Vandals targeted these houses specifically, taking their women as slaves, forcing Roman men to experience the powerlessness they had endured under their own emperor. 237 AD. A military camp on the Rhine frontier, Maximinus Thrax, sits on a specially reinforced throne that still creaks under his weight. Before him, Germanic captives are sorted for various purposes. The warriors will become auxiliaries or die in arenas. The women and children will be sold as slaves. But Maximinus is selecting for something else entirely. He points to a young woman, tall and strong like her tribe produces. She's brought to his tent. She emerges hours later, if she emerges at all, walking in ways that suggest her pelvis has been damaged by attempting to accommodate anatomy never meant for normal humans. Maximinus stood over 8 feet tall according to ancient sources, with proportions that exceeded normal human scale in every dimension. His hands could encompass a man's skull. His strength allowed him to crush armor with bare fingers. But it was his sexual appetite that truly horrified, requiring modifications to furniture, architecture, and victims to accommodate physical realities that bordered on impossible. He rose from Thracian peasant stock to become emperor through military prowess and the simple fact that no one could physically challenge him. In combat, he would grab enemies by their heads and squeeze until skulls cracked. In bed, similar dynamics applied, with partners risking death through pure mechanical stress of attempted coupling. The logistics of Maximinus's intimate life required specialized procurement. Normal women, even willing ones, couldn't survive encounters without significant damage. His agents searched for specific types, tall, heavy, with bone structures that might withstand pressure. Germanic and Dacian women were preferred, their tribes producing individuals closer to his scale. Medical accounts from physicians who treated aftermath describe injuries typically associated with siege warfare. Torn tissue requiring surgical repair. Dislocated hips from positions that exceeded anatomical limits. internal bleeding from organs displaced by intrusion. Some women died during encounters, their bodies simply failing under stresses they weren't designed to endure. The emperor's frustration with these limitations led to increasingly extreme solutions. He commissioned devices, essentially mechanical frameworks, that would support and protect partners while allowing access. He experimented with substances that would relax muscles and dull pain. He sought magical solutions from Eastern mystics, who claimed they could alter human capacity. One account describes Maximinus's attempt to mate with a woman named Claudia, selected for her unusual height and strength. She was prepared for weeks with special exercises, dietary supplements, and gradual stretching using implements of increasing size. The encounter itself required 4 attendants to position and support her. She survived, but never walked normally again, spending remaining years in a wheeled chair. The military camp culture around Maximinus reflected his appetites. Soldiers competed to find women who might satisfy their emperor, treating it as another form of conquest. Tribes learned to offer their largest women as tribute, sometimes breeding specifically for size like livestock. The dehumanization was complete, with humans treated as engineering problems to solve imperial lust. Public appearances required careful choreography to hide evidence. Women who had survived encounters were kept from view until healing concealed damage. Those who died were reported as suffering sudden illness. Families were compensated or threatened into silence. The entire empire participated in pretending the obvious wasn't happening. The psychological impact on Maximinus himself was profound. Ancient sources suggest increasing rage as physical satisfaction remained impossible. He would destroy furniture after failed encounters. He executed servants who couldn't procure adequate partners. His violence in battlefield and bedroom merged into a single expression of frustrated power. Some historians suggest Maximinus's gigantism resulted from pituitary dysfunction that would have caused hormonal imbalances affecting both growth and sexuality. Modern endocrinology recognizes connections between excessive growth hormone and heightened libido. His condition may have created desires that his same condition made impossible to satisfy. The economic cost of maintaining Maximinus's appetites strained imperial resources. Special furniture, medical care for victims, procurement networks, and compensation for families required budgets exceeding small provinces. Soldiers resented resources devoted to their emperor's impossible lusts while they lacked basic supplies. His death in 238 came from his own soldiers during the siege of Aquileia. They killed him while he slept, perhaps the only time he was vulnerable. His head was sent to Rome on a pole, but his body required special transport due to size. Even in death, he presented logistical problems that normal humans didn't. The aftermath revealed hidden victims. Women across the empire came forward with stories of encounters survived, but never reported. Children born with unusual size were recognized as his offspring, creating genealogical complications for families. The full scope of his sexual violence emerged only after fear of retribution passed. Archaeological evidence supports the textual accounts. Reinforced furniture found at sites Maximinus occupied show modifications consistent with excessive weight and stress. Skeletal remains of women from period show trauma patterns that match described injuries. The physical evidence confirms what seemed like exaggeration was actually understated reality. Summer, 376. Constantinople's imperial palace. Emperor Valens conducts a ceremony in chambers that officially don't exist. Smoke from burning herbs makes breathing difficult. The women arranged in ritual positions are either drugged or excellently trained to maintain stillness despite what's happening to their bodies. At the center, Syrian mages promise they're opening doorways to powers that will secure Valens's reign forever. Instead, they're opening pathways to Adrianople, where Gothic cavalry will destroy the Eastern Roman army and Valens himself in flames that witnesses swear burned hotter than normal fire. Valens ruled the Eastern Empire from 364, inheriting power from his brother Valentinian, who took the West. While Valentinian expressed violence through rage and lust, Valens channeled his through occultism that transformed the palace into a laboratory for experiments combining sexuality with sorcery. The initial involvement was defensive. Valens feared magical attacks from rivals, consulting protective specialists. But protection became offense, defense became desire, and soon the emperor was conducting rituals that required components ancient writers refused to specify, calling them unspeakable necessities that violated both divine and natural law. Ammianus Marcellinus, our primary source, describes constant trials for magic in Constantinople, but these weren't persecutions of sorcerers, they were eliminations of competition. Valens wanted monopoly on magical power, executing anyone who might possess knowledge he desired or abilities that threatened his own developing practices. The personnel Valens assembled defied traditional Roman authority structures: Egyptian necromancers, who claimed communication with dead; Persian magi, who promised power over minds; Thracian witches, who knew herbs that could alter consciousness; Syrian temple prostitutes who practiced sacred rituals that supposedly channeled divine energies. The palace became a convergence point for every forbidden tradition in the empire. The ceremonies themselves required specific components that procurement networks struggled to supply: virgin blood taken at moment of defloration, menstrual fluid from women experiencing first bleeding, secretions collected during ritual orgies timed to astronomical events, components that required elaborate infrastructure to obtain and preserve. Women involved in these rituals occupied strange positions between victim and participant. Some were clearly coerced, brought to ceremonies against their will. Others seemed genuinely devoted to practices that promised transcendence through flesh. Many existed in chemically altered states that made consent meaningless, their minds reshaped by substances that removed inhibition and implanted suggestion. One ritual, partially documented in Coptic texts hidden in Egyptian monasteries, involved creating what Valens called living talismans. Women would be selected for specific physical and astrological characteristics. Through combinations of rituals, scarification, and chemical modification, they would supposedly become conduits for supernatural forces. These women would then be kept in special quarters, their bodies used as magical batteries that Valens could draw upon for power. The medical consequences were severe. Palace physicians, sworn to secrecy, treated conditions they couldn't explain through conventional understanding. Women aged decades in months. Hair turned white overnight. Some developed abilities that seemed genuinely supernatural, predicting deaths, seeing distant events, speaking languages they'd never learned. Others simply went mad, their minds shattered by experiences that exceeded human processing capacity. The political implications were equally disturbing. Valens used magically obtained intelligence to purge opponents before they acted. He would know about conspiracies through means that terrified rational Romans. Senators would find their secret thoughts exposed, their private conversations repeated, their hidden desires leveraged for control. Foreign relations incorporated magical warfare. Before meeting Gothic chieftains, Valens would conduct rituals designed to influence their minds. Ambassadors reported feeling compulsions they couldn't explain, agreeing to terms they hadn't intended, experiencing attractions to the emperor that violated their preferences. Whether this was genuine magic or sophisticated psychology enhanced by drugs remains debatable. The Gothic War that culminated at Adrianople was preceded by magical miscalculation. Valens conducted a great ritual, intended to ensure victory, requiring components so extreme that even his Syrian mages expressed reluctance. The ceremony involved sacrificing women who had been specifically prepared through months of ritual conditioning their deaths timed to celestial alignments that supposedly guaranteed divine favor. Instead, something went wrong. Witnesses describe unnatural phenomena during the ritual: temperatures dropping despite summer heat, shadows moving independently of light sources, sounds that couldn't have come from human throats. Valens emerged from the ceremony changed, speaking about visions of his own death by fire, yet compelled to march toward it anyway. At Adrianople on August 9th, 378, Valens died in flames when Goths burned a farmhouse where he had taken shelter. Witnesses reported the fire behaved strangely, burning hotter than wood should produce, consuming the emperor's body so thoroughly that no remains were found. Some suggested this was the magical protection backfiring, the forces he had cultivated turning against their summoner. After his death, the palace chambers where rituals occurred were sealed, then later demolished. Workers reported finding altars stained with substances that defied identification, wall inscriptions in languages that predated known writing, and architectural modifications that served no rational purpose. Everything was destroyed on orders from Theodosius, Valens's successor, who instituted aggressive Christian orthodoxy partly to cleanse the magical contamination. Look at them. 7 emperors across 4 centuries, each transforming imperial authority into machinery for personal gratification. Caracalla in his mother's blood-soaked arms. Valentinian exploding from rage. Constans collecting barbarian beauty. Hadrian drowning his lover for immortality. Valentinian III systematically violating senatorial wives. Maximinus destroying women with his giant's body. Valens mixing sorcery with sexuality until Adrianople burned him alive. These weren't aberrations. They were revelations of what absolute power actually means when restraints disappear. Every emperor faced the same temptation. When you can have anything, when no one can refuse you, when even family becomes property, what boundaries remain? For these 7, the answer was none. The infrastructure that enabled their practices reveals more than individual deviance. The Roman Empire maintained procurement networks that could supply any desire, administrative structures that concealed any crime, medical professionals who treated any consequence, legal systems that justified any violation. This wasn't personal evil but institutional capacity for infinite abuse. Each emperor pushed boundaries further than predecessors. Caracalla made incest imperial, Valentinian made rape judicial, Constans made pederasty policy, Hadrian made murder divine. Valentinian III made violation systematic. Maximinus made impossibility mandatory. Valens made sorcery sovereign. Each expansion of horror became precedent for the next escalation. The victims numbered in thousands, possibly tens of thousands. Not just those directly violated, but families destroyed, bloodlines ended, minds shattered by witnessing or surviving imperial attention. Every emperor left a wake of damage that rippled through generations, children who inherited trauma, communities that learned silence, cultures that internalized subjugation. The complicity ran deeper than enablers and procurers. The entire Roman elite participated through silence, through provision, through pretending not to see what was obvious. Senators who offered their wives to protect their positions, generals who supplied captives for imperial pleasure, priests who blessed atrocities as divine will, physicians who treated injuries they knew were crimes. The empire was built on collective agreement to ignore imperial monstrosity. The documentation itself tells a story. Ancient historians wrote in codes, euphemisms, implications. They couldn't record truth directly without risking execution, but they couldn't ignore it completely without losing credibility. So, they created a language of suggestion, half-truths that pointed toward fully horrific realities. Modern historians must decode deliberately obscured atrocities, reconstructing horror from hints. The religious dimension transcended simple hypocrisy. These emperors were simultaneously gods and monsters, divine authority incarnate, while violating every divine principle. They presided over religious ceremonies while fresh from violations. They issued moral legislation while practicing immorality. They were worshipped as sacred while conducting themselves as demonic. The cognitive dissonance destroyed Roman concepts of sacredness itself. The economic cost was staggering. Maintaining imperial appetites required resources that could have funded armies, built cities, fed provinces. The procurement networks, the medical care, the compensation and silence payments, the architectural modifications, the ceremonies and rituals, all demanded expenditures that contributed to imperial bankruptcy. The Western Empire didn't just fall to barbarians, it collapsed under the weight of its own rulers' appetites. The military implications were equally severe. Soldiers who should have been fighting were procuring. Generals who should have been strategizing were enabling. Resources that should have supplied frontiers were diverted to imperial pleasures. The barbarians didn't defeat Rome so much as walk through doors left open by emperors, too focused on their appetites to notice invasion. The cultural impact persisted long after Rome fell. These imperial practices became legendary horrors that shaped medieval concepts of evil. When Dante designed his Inferno, he was partially inspired by Roman imperial atrocities. When medieval moralists warned against power's corruption, they cited these emperors. When Renaissance thinkers questioned absolute authority, these were the cautionary tales they referenced. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Every system that concentrates power without accountability risks producing similar monsters. The infrastructure of abuse, once established, seeks users. The networks of procurement, once created, demand supply. The culture of silence, once normalized, enables escalation. These Roman emperors aren't ancient history, but warnings about power's permanent dangers. The archaeological evidence continues emerging. Excavations regularly uncover evidence of practices that confirm or exceed textual accounts, skeletal trauma that matches described violations, architectural features that served documented purposes, chemical residues that confirm reported substances. The physical record validates what seemed like exaggeration, suggesting reality was worse than rhetoric. They were born into horror. The children of these emperors, the offspring of their victims, the generations that inherited trauma embedded in their bones. Some were products of incest, others of rape, many of circumstances that Roman law couldn't classify because they exceeded legal imagination. Caracalla's relationship with Julia Domna may have produced offspring that palace records deliberately obscured. Servants whispered about infants born with deformities, hidden in palace chambers, eliminated before they could become dynastic complications. One account mentions a child who lived 3 years, kept in rooms where only deaf-mute slaves could enter, killed when its resemblance to both Caracalla and his mother became undeniable. The procurement networks that supplied imperial appetites often involved children who grew up knowing they existed only for eventual consumption. Training began young, sometimes from birth. They learned to move in ways that pleased, speak in tones that aroused, position themselves for optimal viewing. By the time they reached useful age, they weren't human anymore, but perfectly crafted instruments for imperial pleasure. These children occupied a unique legal limbo, not quite slaves, since they might be acknowledged offspring, not quite free, since their existence depended on imperial whim, not quite Roman, since their origins were deliberately obscured. They lived in palace shadows, educated enough to be entertaining, but never enough to be dangerous, existing only as long as they remained useful or amusing. Hadrian's deification of Antinous created a different kind of offspring, spiritual children of a manufactured god. Young people across the empire were recruited into Antinous cults that promised immortality through reenacting the divine youth's relationship with Hadrian. These weren't metaphorical reenactments. Priests who had been trained by Hadrian himself, taught initiates exactly how the emperor had loved his favorite, transforming imperial lust into religious practice. The barbarian boys that Constans collected often left pregnant women in their wake when they were eventually discarded. These children, half Roman but legally barbarian, created genealogical chaos in frontier regions. Neither culture claimed them. They couldn't inherit through Roman law or barbarian custom. They existed as living reminders of imperial appetite, bearing features that marked them as products of violation disguised as favor. Maximinus Thrax's offspring posed unique challenges. Children who inherited his gigantism couldn't be hidden or ignored. They stood out literally and figuratively, their size announcing their parentage. Some were killed at birth when their scale became apparent. Others were sent to specific military units that specialized in managing imperial embarrassments. A few survived to adulthood, their massive frames making them valuable as soldiers but dangerous as potential claimants. The systematic violations under Valentinian III produced a generation of senatorial children who knew their official fathers weren't their biological ones. These open secrets poisoned Roman aristocracy from within. Brothers who looked nothing alike, sisters who bore imperial features, inheritances contested based on obvious but unspoken truths. The emperor had literally bred confusion into Rome's elite bloodlines. More disturbing were the children born from magical rituals under Valens. Some accounts describe infants that seemed normal initially, but developed uncanny abilities as they aged. Children who knew things they couldn't have learned, who spoke to invisible presences, who caused unexplained phenomena in their vicinity. Most were quietly eliminated when their nature became apparent, but rumors persisted of some surviving in remote monasteries where their abilities could be contained through constant prayer. The educational systems for imperial children reflected their fathers' priorities. They learned languages to communicate with diverse victims. They studied anatomy to understand physical limits. They were taught laws specifically to identify loopholes. Their curriculum prepared them not for governance but for gratification, creating generations of rulers who saw empire as apparatus for appetite. Some children tried to break patterns. Marcus Aurelius Antinous, son of Caracalla, though possibly also grandson if rumors about Julia Domna were true, attempted reforms during his brief reign as Elagabalus, but his solutions involved different expressions of the same excessive sexuality, suggesting trauma had merely mutated rather than healed. He was killed at 18, his body thrown into the Tiber, erased like his father had erased his uncle. Others embraced their inheritance fully. They competed to exceed their father's atrocities, viewing extreme behavior as birthright and obligation. They established dynasties of degeneracy, where each generation tried to surpass previous violations. These bloodlines didn't die out naturally, but had to be systematically eliminated through assassination, often by their own guards who couldn't endure another generation of imperial monster. The daughters faced unique challenges. They knew what imperial women endured, having witnessed or experienced it themselves. Some became perpetrators, having learned that power meant inflicting what they had suffered. Others retreated into religious life so extreme that it suggested attempts to atone for sins they hadn't committed but had inherited through blood. The medical knowledge accumulated from treating imperial offspring was preserved in texts that survived in Byzantine libraries. Physicians documented conditions they couldn't explain through normal heredity. Children who aged rapidly as if their bodies were burning through life force. Others who seemed frozen in childhood despite advancing years. Anatomical variations that suggested their conception had involved forces beyond normal biology. The question of souls haunted Roman theology. Did children conceived through violation, incest, or sorcery possess normal souls? Could they achieve salvation? Were they human or something else wearing human shape? These questions weren't academic for the children themselves, who grew up knowing their existence raised theological problems that no doctrine adequately addressed. The foster systems that managed imperial bastards created networks of hidden influence. Families that raised emperors' unacknowledged children gained subtle power through implied connections. They could hint at secrets, suggest influences, leverage possibilities. The empire was riddled with these shadow dynasties, bloodlines that officially didn't exist but practically shaped policy. Some children simply vanished, sent to frontier garrisons that didn't exist on official maps, confined in monasteries that took vows of silence so absolute that they wouldn't confirm their own existence. Eliminated through methods that left no trace. The empire had perfected techniques for making people disappear so thoroughly that even their absence wasn't noticed. February 11th, 211 AD. Return to that room where Julia Domna holds Getta's cooling corpse, while Caracalla watches with satisfaction that has nothing to do with political victory. The blood pooling on marble floors would never wash clean. Servants would scrub for days, but the stain would remain, faint but visible, a shadow that grew darker in certain lights. That stain spread across the empire, seeping into foundations, contaminating everything built upon it. Every emperor who followed stood on floors marked by predecessors' atrocities. Every palace contained rooms where unspeakable acts had occurred. Every throne bore invisible imprints of monsters who had occupied it. The empire didn't just tolerate these horrors, it was constructed from them. 455 AD, Valentinian III bleeds out while his killers recite their wives' names. The blood mixes with soil that has absorbed centuries of similar violence. The grass that grows there will be unusually dark, fed by imperial corruption that has saturated the earth itself. Rome hasn't fallen yet, but its foundations are rotting from within, weakened by rulers who consumed the empire they were supposed to protect. 378 AD. Valens burns at Adrianople in flames witnesses swear were supernatural. The fire that consumes him seems hungry, as if collecting payment for powers invoked through rituals that violated natural order. His ashes scatter on winds that carry them across territories that will soon belong to Goths, Vandals, Huns. The Western Empire has less than a century remaining. The Eastern Empire will continue for another 1,000 years, but it will never again produce emperors of such spectacular monstrosity. These weren't the famous monsters, not Nero or Caligula, whose names became synonymous with excess. These were the forgotten ones, the emperors whose atrocities were too specific, too disturbing, too revealing of what imperial power actually meant. Their stories were suppressed not because they were false, but because they were true in ways that threatened the entire concept of legitimate authority. Caracalla showed that family was no barrier to imperial appetite. Valentinian demonstrated that law was merely formalized violation. Constans revealed that military power served primarily to procure pleasure. Hadrian proved that love and murder were compatible, even complementary. Valentinian III established that systematic rape could be administrative policy. Maximinus embodied the physical impossibility of satisfaction when power exceeded human scale. Valens combined sovereignty with sorcery until reality itself rebelled. Together, they form a pattern that transcends individual pathology. They reveal the logic of absolute power. When nothing is forbidden, everything becomes mandatory. When restraint disappears, appetite expands infinitely. When humans become gods, they behave like demons. The Roman Empire didn't produce these monsters accidentally, but inevitably, as natural products of systems that concentrated power without accountability. The infrastructure they created survived them. Procurement networks established for imperial pleasure evolved into medieval slave trades. Administrative structures designed to conceal atrocities became bureaucracies that normalized oppression. Legal frameworks that justified violation influenced law codes for centuries. The Roman legacy includes not just aqueducts and architecture, but systems for satisfying power's darkest appetites. The documentation they tried to destroy keeps surfacing. Hidden texts in monastery walls, coded accounts in family archives, archaeological evidence that confirms or exceeds written records. Each discovery reveals new depths, suggesting that what we know represents a fraction of what occurred. The full truth may be literally unspeakable, exceeding language's capacity to convey horror. The bloodlines they created still exist, diluted but present in populations across Europe, Asia, Africa. DNA studies reveal unexpected connections, suggestions of relationships that official genealogies deny. We carry their genetic legacy without knowing it, inherited trauma encoded in chromosomes, ancestral memories of violations that shaped subsequent generations' fears and behaviors. The theological questions they raised remain unanswered. Can souls be corrupted through flesh? Does power transform human nature or reveal it? Are there acts that damn not just perpetrators but entire systems that enable them? These emperors forced confrontation with possibilities that Roman religion couldn't accommodate, contributing to Christianity's rise as alternative that promised divine justice for earthly atrocities. The modern implications are uncomfortable but unavoidable. Every system that concentrates power risks producing similar monsters. The infrastructure of abuse, once established, seeks users. The culture of complicity, once normalized, enables escalation. These emperors aren't ancient warnings, but contemporary relevance, showing what happens when accountability disappears and appetite becomes authority. We study them not for sensationalism, but for recognition. Recognition that power without restraint becomes predation. That systems designed for governance can become machinery for gratification. That humans given godlike authority behave with demonic creativity. That civilization's heights are built on depths we prefer not to acknowledge. Julia Domna died in 217, finally free from the son who had made her simultaneously empress and victim. She starved herself to death, refusing food and medicine, choosing obliteration over continued existence in a world shaped by imperial atrocity. Her last words, according to witnesses, were, "The stain won't wash out. She might have meant Geta's blood on her clothes. She might have meant the empire itself. The stain remains, in ruins of palaces where atrocities occurred, in legal codes that normalized violation, in bloodlines that carry genetic echoes of imperial excess, in systems that concentrate power without accountability, in appetites that expand when restraints disappear, in the recognition that humans given absolute authority will absolutely corrupt it." These 7 emperors weren't exceptions, but examples. Examples of what happens when power meets pathology, when system enables psychopathy, when empire becomes apparatus for imperial pleasure. They showed us the worst of what humans can become when nothing prevents them from becoming it. The blood never washed out, not from marble floors or imperial purple or historical memory. It seeped into foundations, contaminated groundwater, poisoned soil. Everything built on those foundations carries the stain. Every system descended from those structures inherits the contamination. Every concentration of power risks reactivating dormant potentials for atrocity. They ruled for decades or years or months, but their impact persists across millennia, not through monuments or laws or dynasties, but through demonstrations of power's ultimate implications. They showed us what authority becomes without accountability, what humanity becomes without restraint, what civilization becomes when it serves only to satisfy its rulers' appetites. The Roman Empire fell, but the patterns they established persist. In every system that concentrates power, in every structure that enables abuse, in every culture that normalizes complicity, in every silence that permits escalation, they are gone but not absent, dead but not departed, buried but not erased. The imperial purple was retired after Rome's fall, the color too associated with atrocity to continue. But purple, was just dye. The real stain was deeper, permanent, spreading through systems that inherited Roman concepts of authority without Roman restraints on its exercise. We wear that stain still, invisible but present, inherited shame for atrocities we didn't commit, but from which our civilization descends. Caracalla watches his brother die in their mother's arms, and feels nothing but satisfaction. Valentinian explodes from rage that finally turned inward. Constans flees through snow from soldiers disgusted by his collections. Hadrian drowns his lover for a divinity that exists only in marble. Valentinian III bleeds out while his victims' names echo across the Campus Martius. Maximinus dies in his tent, too large for normal human killing. Valens burns in flames that might have been supernatural, or might have been justice. They are gone, but what they revealed about power remains. The capacity for monstrosity that authority enables. The infrastructure of atrocity that systems create. The human potential for horror when restraints disappear. They were not the worst because they were not the last. The stain spreads still. The blood never dries. The pattern persists. Power corrupts, absolutely, infinitely, eternally. As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Unless we remember what they showed us, unless we recognize what they revealed, unless we understand what they warn us remains possible. Always possible. Forever possible. Wherever power concentrates without accountability, wherever appetite becomes authority, wherever humans become gods. The lesson writes itself in blood that won't wash out. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt absolutely. It reveals absolutely what corruption always existed, waiting for permission to manifest. These 7 emperors gave it permission. Who gives it permission now? If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting to uncover more buried truths, I've prepared another journey into the shadows of the past that you won't want to miss. Click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can continue peeling back the layers of history together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.